In today's episode, the Celtics win Game 3. They look to be on their way to Banner 18. We look back at the postseason as a whole and try and consider whether this has just been a very boring postseason the way that I think that it is, and also talk about the last handful of finals that we've had and why we just can't get a good competitive final series, it seems like. But first, of course, we need to talk about Game 3 Mavs Celtics. The Celtics win Game 3. They look to be on their way to Banner 18, and despite a fourth quarter comeback by the Mavs where Boston went into there, let's dribble the ball for 20 seconds and jack up a contested jumper offense that allowed the Mavs to get back in the game. Luka then fouls out and Kyrie's just not able to bring them to the finish line. Even with all of that, this game more than any of the others showed how non-competitive this series has truly been from a personnel standpoint. Because coming into the game, the big storyline is Kristaps Porzingis. His injury prevents him from playing in a game and presumably for the rest of the series. Regardless of the outcome of this game, it seems like KP probably wasn't going to return to the finals. And this was Dallas's opportunity because I thought that it allowed them to always have someone to attack on the floor offensively, whoever the fifth guy was, whether it be Al Horford out there, whether it be potentially Luke Kornet, Xavier Tillman, O'Shea Brissett, Peyton Pritchard, Sam Hauser, all these guys could potentially play more minutes, and that's going to give Dallas an option to attack that they wouldn't normally have, of course, with KP out there has been good defensively, even a little bit on the perimeter guarding switches and things like that. That just didn't materialize at all for Dallas. Horford was good. Xavier Tillman came in and gave them good minutes. Pritchard and Hauser held up extremely well defensively, and it just continues to illustrate how much of a personnel issue this series has been for Dallas, and specifically defensively. Boston hasn't had any kind of crazy offensive explosions in any of these games from a points perspective, but that's mostly just been because of variance of three-point shooting. If Boston shot the ball better from three in this series, they'd be scoring way better. They're getting open looks every time down the floor, which is surprising for a Dallas team that has been arguably the main story for them on their road to the finals has been how good they've been defensively, and obviously Luka and Kyrie at the end of these games, but they've been one of the better defenses in the entirety of the playoffs, and Dallas has not looked that way at all. Boston has just completely torn them apart with their 5-out spacing, with their ability to attack it one-on-one and mismatches. We talked about this in the last episode. A big reason for that is just that there's nobody you can ignore for Boston. There's no Rudy Gobert out there. There's no there's nobody out there that you can just say, hey, it's Josh Giddey. We don't have to worry about him shooting. They can't load up on the ball the way that they have in other series, and that has made it abundantly clear how poor of a defender at times Kyrie can be just because he's small, how poor of a defender Luka can be just because you can blow right by him and get to the rim. That was especially an issue in this game as well, and ultimately, Boston's going to win the title. They're the better team. They're arguably the best team in the entire league. They're on the way to potentially a 16-2 postseason, which doesn't happen very often. I mean, last year Denver went 16-4, and that was unbelievably impressive. If they end up with a sweep 16-2 on your way to a title, the best that we've seen recently was the Warriors went 16-1 when KD got there. 16-2 is right up there with them. Obviously, you can talk about the path to the finals, but still unbelievably impressive for Boston. And one of the main storylines, I think, coming out of this game is going to be the fact that Luka got into foul trouble and ultimately fouled out of the game. And with the way that Dallas was coming back at the end of the game, you thought, oh, well, maybe they're going to be able to make this happen. Luka fouls out, and obviously it's much more difficult at that point. And he talked in the post-game press conference about, oh, you can't get 6 fouls in the finals. Like, the refs got to be better, da-da-da. He had 2 fouls going into the fourth quarter, one of which was like a stupid reach-in foul earlier on in the game. And every foul that he committed in the fourth was a real foul. If you want to argue the Jaylen Brown hooking one, or you want to argue the Jaylen Brown blocking foul that have ultimately fouled Luka out of the game, that's fine. You can argue that. But he earned every foul that he got, and it doesn't really make sense to argue, oh man, how did I foul out of the game when you had 2 fouls going into the fourth? A little bit more situational awareness there for Luka. Tough Luka game in general, complaining after every play, didn't shoot the ball well, didn't look healthy at all, didn't look like someone that wanted to guard at all, didn't look like someone that was capable of guarding at all, and his defensive issues have been completely exposed in a series in which Boston spacing has just completely destroyed any semblance of good defense that Dallas was able to put out there. And as I said, it looks like we are headed towards Banner 18 for the Celtics. And it makes me think about this postseason in general, because there's a lot of conversations had about whether the finals feel like the finals now. It's a new broadcasting crew. There's no trophy on the floor as there was all those years ago. And I'd have to agree with that. For whatever reason, the finals just don't feel as impactful. They don't feel like they're as big of a deal. I don't know if that's a matchup thing. I don't know if it's been because the series haven't been as competitive, but there's definitely something to that. And if you go backwards, thinking about some of the series that we've had recently in the finals, last year was not entertaining at all as Denver went on to win. 2022 was Boston Golden State, which was a pretty good 6-game series, but I couldn't tell you more than a few moments from that finals off the top of my head. The year prior, 21, was pretty good. Milwaukee, Phoenix, of course, you have the Giannis, alley-oop dunk at the end, Giannis getting his first title. That was a good series legitimately. 2020 in the bubble was fine. Like, it was Heat Lakers. We all pretty much knew the Lakers were going to win the title despite some Jimmy Butler moments there. 2019 was certainly interesting, but obviously the injury stuff made it feel like a foregone conclusion once the Warriors are missing so many guys. Clay gets hurt, KD gets hurt, and even with a great effort from Steph near the end of that series, not super memorable. And then 18 and 17, the Warriors dominated each of those. So the last really awesome finals we got was 2016. Of course, the Cavs come back from down 3-1 and beat Golden State. But other than that, there's been a couple of pretty interesting 6-game series that I've mentioned here as we go backwards. But I don't really have an explanation for why that is, like why exactly the finals haven't felt as competitive. They haven't felt like as big of a deal. I mean, there's an argument to be made for just the increased 3-point shooting. So the individual games just depend on the variance of shot making from game to game. And that can just create some of these individual games that aren't all that interesting or aren't all that impactful. And I think that also kind of carries over to this postseason in general, because when you look back at this playoffs, I'm trying to think of a handful of really cool, really interesting moments from this playoffs. We have the Luka shot against Minnesota. That's ultimately a 5-game series. Boston sweeps Indiana. Denver, Minnesota was an awesome series as a whole, but the individual games, a lot of them were blowouts. Like Game 7 was pretty cool, but a lot of the individual games were complete blowouts and not that interesting, despite the fact that it was a 7-game series. And if you had to go back and think, okay, what was the most interesting, what was the most entertaining series of the entire playoffs this year? It's probably Knicks Sixers in the first round. Like that's probably the most entertaining series I can remember. And despite the fact that there's some other 7-game ones like Knicks Pacers, but for whatever reason, this postseason just never really grabbed me. It never really felt like there was this prevailing storyline that was super interesting. Early on, the Anthony Edwards stuff was pretty cool because of how potentially ahead of schedule he was as a postseason performer and what that could potentially mean for him moving forward as like maybe the face of the league potentially. And then obviously that all falls apart in the Dallas series. There was no, other than Dallas's run to the finals and that being a surprise, there was no real prevailing like narrative or thread to follow here that made this particular postseason all that interesting. And part of that is probably because from a competitive, like who could actually make the finals standpoint, one side of the league was completely decided basically before the postseason even started, with Boston making the finals and obviously being the best team in the league with the way that they're dealing with this Mavs team in the finals. But their run through the East was just not that interesting. And for them to go on and go potentially 16-2 in the playoffs is an incredible accomplishment. But if you're talking about strictly from an entertainment standpoint, you would wish for something more as an NBA fan. Certainly Celtics fans are totally fine with it. But the fact that one side of the conference, whether it be due to injury or lack of competitiveness of the conference as a whole, was just completely decided before things even started, certainly had an impact. And again, I can't really remember, as someone that watched almost every minute of almost every game of the postseason, I can't remember that many interesting moments in the playoffs. And I don't even know if like that's necessarily a bad thing. There's anything the league can do about that. If that says anything about the league as a whole, it's just one of those years, right? But for some reason, it feels like the last 5 to 7 years we've had, it's just one of those years, especially in the finals, a lot. And I don't know if that has to do with the style of play being so similar. I don't know if that has to do with some of the smaller market versus bigger market stuff where some of these teams have an advantage in terms of spending. Obviously, that stuff is going to change now with the second apron and some teams not being willing to pay the luxury tax and all that stuff. But I don't really have an explanation for it. It's just, man, it feels like a lot of these playoff series and a lot of these finals just haven't been nearly as competitive as you'd want them to be. And maybe the reason that I feel that way is just because the finals hasn't felt all that satisfying, and maybe just, no offense to Mavs fans, but maybe just the wrong team made the finals in the West. They Obviously played extremely well against Minnesota. Minnesota team that at certain points in the beginning of the playoffs, people thought was the best team in the entire league. And no disrespect to Dallas, I'm not taking anything away from them. Making the finals is not an easy thing to do, but it's hard for me to think that if Minnesota or probably more importantly Denver had made it to the finals, that we wouldn't have had a more competitive and a more interesting series. Obviously, as of this recording, the series isn't technically over, but in 152 tries, no team has ever come back from down 0-3. Now, all of those, to my knowledge, all those teams have played game 4, so they still have a chance. There's still a game to be played, but it does make me wonder, like, what if Denver had made the finals? To a lesser extent, what if Minnesota made the finals? I mean, Denver was up at home game 7 late in the game, and they just weren't able to bring it home. And I'd have a hard time thinking that they wouldn't have been able to beat Dallas and then matched up better against Boston. They still would have had issues, certainly, with some of the defensive stuff that Dallas has had issues with, of course, with Jokic out in space. And some of the defensive stuff for Denver just wasn't as good as it was the prior year. But I still think that they would have had a better chance than what Dallas has been able to put forth in the series, certainly with KP getting injured. And as we look forward now for both Boston and Dallas, into their potential off seasons, I guess at this point, Boston's going to be fine. Obviously, they were able to lock up their free agency issues with Drew Holiday in the middle of the year. They signed him to a long-term contract. Tatum is going to need a new deal at some point. They'll just give him an extension. And winning the title was extremely critical, obviously, to keeping this team together, because there was a scenario this postseason with as easy as their path potentially could have been to the finals, where if they disappointed, they didn't make the finals. We talked about this at the time that Jaylen Brown signed the contract last offseason. Like, there was a real possibility of him being on a different